Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Always.
Today, we're going down a rabbit hole that's, well, it's both captivating and, honestly, a little unsettling.
Huh. Do tell.
We're looking into Rhonda Belle Martin.
Rhonda Belle Martin. The name rings a bell, vaguely.
She was executed in Alabama back in 1957.
Okay, I'm starting to remember now. Wasn't she accused of poisoning, like, a whole bunch of people?
That's the one. We've got biographical info, court records, newspaper articles from back then, a real mix of sources. And we're going to try to piece together, well, what could lead someone to do something like that, you know?
Yeah, it's a fascinating case, for sure. It really makes you think about, like, the times back then, how different things were, their understanding of mental health and all that. It's not just some true crime story. It's like a window into a whole different era.
Exactly. Okay, so Rhonda Belle Martin, born in Alabama around 1907, worked as a waitress, and get this, she was married 6 times.
6 times? Wow. That's a lot of trips down the aisle. You know what strikes on, though? There's barely any detailed information about her early life.
It's true. It's almost like we're starting with a blank slate, which makes the whole story even more, like, mysterious.
It does make you wonder, right? Like, what happened in those early years that might have, put her on this path?
Yeah, but let's move on to the events that really made her infamous, the poisonings.
Right, the poisonings is like this chilling timeline. It starts with her mother's death in 1944. Then several of her husbands died under, let's just say, mysterious circumstances. And then 5 of her own children.
5. 5 of her children. That's just, I don't even know what to say. The youngest was under 2 years old.
And she used rat poison.
Rat poison. It's hard to even wrap your head around that. It brings us to one of the biggest mysteries in this case, and that's the motive. Why? Why did she do it?
Right, the motive. The prosecutors back then, they were all about the insurance money angle.
But that doesn't really hold up, does it?
Not really. The amounts she collected were tiny. Barely enough to cover funeral costs.
And Rhonda Bell herself, she never admitted to any kind of financial motive. This is where things get really interesting, psychologically speaking. If it wasn't about the money, then what was it? Some people have thrown out ideas like jealousy or revenge, but without more information about her relationships, it's all just speculation. Could it have been, I don't know, some kind of mental illness?
That's definitely a possibility, especially given the time period. Mental health wasn't exactly a hot topic back then. Treatments were limited, and there's a lot of, well, misunderstanding. Today we might look at a case like this through a very different lens.
Yeah, you're right. We might consider things like personality disorders or even, Munchausen by proxy, given how she seemed to harm those closest to her. And speaking of disturbing details, there's that whole thing about the get well cards.
Oh, right. That detail from the Life magazine article.
Apparently, she really got a kick out of receiving those cards after each death, and then, of course, the sympathy cards later on.
Yeah, that's pretty chilling. Was it like a morbid fascination with death? Or some twisted desire for attention? It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely points to some kind of psychological complexity that we need to unpack. Now, there's another twist in this story that adds even more layers. It involves her 5th husband, Ronald.
Ah, yes, Ronald, the former stepson. He was poisoned too, but he survived, didn't he?
He did, but he was left with some permanent disabilities. And his survival was actually a major turning point in the case.
How so?
Well, it was his illness, you see, that finally raised red flags for the authorities. It prompted them to really dig into all the deaths surrounding Rhonda Belle.
Wow, so it's like fate intervened, they finally caught her, and she confessed to all the murders.
Well, initially, yes. She confessed to everything. But then she recanted her confession regarding 2 of her children.
Whoa, a recanted confession. Was that like a genuine change of heart? Or some kind of legal strategy? What do you think?
It's impossible to know for sure, really. Was it remorse? Manipulation? Or maybe just a desperate attempt to control the narrative, even as she was facing, the ultimate penalty. Her motives remained a complete mystery throughout the entire case.
Okay, so she ends up going to trial for the murder of her 4th husband, Claude Carroll Martin. And this is where things get really interesting, legally speaking, because even though she was only convicted of this one murder, she was sentenced to death.
Right. And, while I can understand the context of the time, sentencing her to death based on one murder when there was all this evidence for others, well, it seems a bit questionable, doesn't it?
It does. How do you think this case would be handled today?
You're right to point that out. It's crucial to remember that this was 1950s Alabama. The legal system was a whole different beast back then. Capital punishment was way more common. Plus, forensic science wasn't nearly as advanced. Today, investigators would have a lot more tools at their disposal to examine the evidence. And the defense would likely focus much more aggressively on, her mental state.
So the jury back then wasn't swayed by any arguments that she might have been mentally ill?
Nope, not at all. This was a time when mental health was still largely misunderstood and stigmatized. The insanity defense rarely worked.
Wow. It's amazing to think how much our understanding of mental health has changed and how that's impacted legal proceedings.
Absolutely. It's a completely different world now.
Okay, so she's on death row, facing execution. What was that period like for her?
It's interesting, because of her heart condition, the prison officials often kept her execution dates a secret. They were afraid she might have a heart attack before they could carry out the sentence.
Wow. That detail just adds another layer of complexity to this whole story. Didn't she also have a clemency hearing?
She did. Her lawyer argued that her sanity hadn't been properly assessed, which, looking back from our perspective now with a better understanding of mental health, that argument carries even more weight. But ultimately, the clemency plea was denied.
And so on October 11, 1957, Rhonda Belle Martin was led to the electric chair at Kilby Prison. It's almost hard to believe that this happened less than a century ago. It feels like a world away.
It does, doesn't it? And yet, it's a stark reminder of just how far we've come in terms of our understanding of, the human mind and the legal system. Now, let's talk about the execution itself. According to newspaper accounts, there was a pretty disturbing incident.
What happened?
Well, apparently the executioners, they threw the switch to activate the electric current before the electrodes were properly in place.
Oh my gosh. Can you imagine the psychological torment of those extra few minutes knowing what was about to happen? It's a grim reminder of the inherent brutality of capital punishment, no matter the crime.
It is. It raises all these ethical questions that we're still grappling with today. But you know what's even more haunting? She refused to make a final statement.
Really, no last words, no attempt to explain her actions.
Nothing. It's almost as if she took her secrets to the graves with her, which just leaves us with even more unanswered questions.
That silence is deafening, isn't it? It's like she wanted to maintain that air of mystery, even in death.
And that's especially strange when you consider that she had actually expressed a desire to donate her body to science.
Donate her body to science.
Yeah, she wanted to be studied, to be understood. Maybe even to find some kind of explanation for her own actions. It's almost tragic in a way.
It is. It's like she was searching for answers, for some kind of redemption, even while she was committing these horrible acts. But that wish to donate her body, it was never granted. Instead, her family received her remains. And we're left with this unsettling sense of ambiguity, a puzzle with missing pieces.
We are, and maybe that's the most important takeaway from Rhonda Belle Martin's story. That sometimes, even the most heinous acts, they defy easy explanation. The human mind is a labyrinth, full of dark corners and hidden motivations. And in this case, well, we're left to grapple with those mysteries, to try to understand what could drive someone to such extremes.
And this is just the beginning of our deep dive into the life and crimes of Rhonda Belle Martin. When we come back, we'll delve deeper to the trial, the execution, and all those lingering questions that continue to swirl around this case. So we were just talking about Rhonda Belle Martin's desire to donate her body to science. It wasn't granted, but it's like she wanted to be studied. Maybe you have to try and understand, I don't know, why she did what she did.
Yeah, it really makes you think, did she see herself as some kind of puzzle to be solved?
Right. But before we get into what happened, let's back up a little. Let's talk about her trial. What were the main arguments from both sides?
Well, the prosecution, from what I remember from the court records, they really focused on her confession. They tried to paint this picture of her being, cold, calculating, like she planned it all out.
They said she was motivated by money, didn't they? But we've already talked about how that doesn't really add up.
Exactly. For prosecution, they really leaned hard on that confession. But they also pointed out the premeditation, especially with that rat poison. So what about the defense? What was their strategy?
Well, they tried to say that maybe her confession wasn't totally illegit, like maybe she was pressured into it. And they hinted at the idea that she wasn't really aware of what she was doing. Remember, back then, mental illness was a whole different ballgame.
It really makes you think about how this case might have gone down in a modern courtroom, doesn't it?
It does.
The 1950s, their approach to mental health was just so different. I mean, they were using terms like psychopath and sociopath, but without really understanding what those terms meant.
Right. So the jury, they weren't convinced by the defense's arguments.
Nope, not at all. They found her guilty of first-degree murder for the death of her fourth husband, Claude Carroll Martin, and like we said before, that one conviction was enough to send her to death row back then.
But sentencing her to death for just that one murder, even though they suspected she'd done so much more, it seems a bit, I don't know, unbalanced.
It does raise questions about how things worked back then. Today, it would be totally different. They'd probably try her for all of the murders, And the defense would bring in, all sorts of experts to talk about her mental state.
Okay, so let's get to the execution. You mentioned that something went wrong with the electric chair.
Yeah, it's a really chilling detail. The newspaper accounts say that they actually turned on the electricity before the electrodes were even in the right place.
Oh, gosh. Just thinking about those extra few minutes, knowing what was coming, it's horrible.
It's a reminder of how awful the death penalty can be no matter what the person did. So what about the public? How did they react to this whole thing?
Yeah, were people talking about her mental state at all?
This case, it was all over the news. Everyone was talking about it. Some people, they thought she was a monster, plain and simple. They said she deserved what she got. But others, they weren't so sure. They questioned whether she was really in her right mind. They thought maybe the death penalty was too much.
So it started a debate about capital punishment.
Absolutely. And as you know, we're still having that debate today. Rhonda Belle Martin's case, it forces us to think about our own beliefs, about justice, about punishment, about good and evil.
It's a lot to think about, but that's what's so interesting about all this. We're talking about something that happened decades ago, but it still matters today.
It does. Rhonda Belle Martin's story, it's a reminder that even when we do terrible things, sometimes there's no easy explanation. We can look at all the evidence, try to understand, but we might never really know what's going on in someone's mind.
Right, and her silence, the fact that she didn't say anything to explain herself, that just makes it even more mysterious.
And, she wanted to donate her body to science. It's like she was searching for answers herself.
That's such a sad thought, trying to figure out why she did what she did, even as she was facing execution.
It is, and it just goes to show it. Sometimes, even when we're faced with things we don't understand, we have to try to make sense of them.
We've talked about Rhonda Belle Martin's early life, her crimes, the trial, and her execution. Now I think it's time to talk about her legacy. What does this case tell us about capital punishment in America? So we've really been digging into this whole Rhonda Belle Martin case, and it's a lot to process. But before we wrap things up, I think it's important to zoom out a bit, see how this story fits into the bigger picture of capital punishment in America. A lot has changed since 1957, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just think about how people view the death penalty now compared to back then. And the laws around it, it's a completely different landscape. Rhonda Belle Martin, she was actually the third and last woman to be executed by electric chair in Alabama.
Really? Before when?
Before that big Furman v. Georgia ruling in 1972. The one that basically stopped executions across the whole country for a while.
Oh, yeah. I remember learning about that. So what was the thinking behind that ruling?
Well, the Supreme Court, they didn't actually say the death penalty was unconstitutional. It was more about, how it was being used. It was all over the place.
So some states were doing it one way, some another.
Yeah, and there was a lot of concern about racial bias and, just a lack of clear standards for who got sentenced to death. The court basically said, hey, you got to make this fairer or you got to stop doing it altogether.
Okay, so it was more about making things consistent and equitable.
That's it. And it forced states to really rethink their whole approach to the death penalty.
What about Alabama? Did they bring back capital punishment eventually?
Yep, they revised their laws to address those concerns that the Supreme Court raised, and they started executions again in 1983. But get this, Rhonda Belle Martin, she remained the last woman executed in Alabama until 2002.
Whoa, that's almost 50 years. Crazy. It makes you wonder, if her case happened later, after all those legal changes, would things turn out differently?
It's hard to say, right? Would she still have gotten the death penalty? Would they have looked more closely at her mental state? It's all speculation, but it's interesting to think about.
Throughout this whole deep dive, the motive thing keeps coming back to me. We've talked about money, jealousy, revenge, but none of it really feels like the whole story. It's like we're missing a piece.
Yeah, it's one of the most puzzling things about this whole case. Why did she do it? We might never know.
And the fact that she never said anything, never tried to explain herself, it just adds to the mystery.
I know. It's almost like she wanted us to keep wondering.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Rhonda Belle Martin's life and crimes, what are the main takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think it shows that history is full of these stories, these dark, mysterious stories that force us to confront the fact that we don't always understand why people do what they do.
Yeah, it reminds us that we're all capable of good and bad, and sometimes there's no simple explanation.
And it's a reminder to, be careful about judging too quickly, especially when we don't have all the facts.
I think it also makes us think about how our legal system has changed and how our understanding of things like mental illness has evolved.
Yeah, these are important conversations to have, even today.
So to finish things up, I have a question for you and for our listeners. If Rhonda Belle Martin were alive today and could tell us why she did what she did, what do you think she would say?
Wow, that's a tough one. I'm not sure I have an answer. but it's something to think about, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's what makes this story so powerful. It makes us question, makes us think, makes us want to understand. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the life and crimes of Rhonda Belle Martin. We'll be back soon with another deep dive, ready to uncover more fascinating and thought-provoking stories from the past.